Welcome to this episode of Exploring the Humanities, Voices from the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. Our podcasts allow us to showcase the exciting and innovative work being done by our colleagues in the humanities, intersecting with fields as varied as aviation, mental and physical health, virtual reality, GenAI, design, neuroscience.
I am Lydia Cathedral, an assistant professor in the Department of English and Communication at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. Today, I am interviewing Professor Tony McEnery, chair professor in the Department of English and Communication and a leading expert in corpus linguistics. Across his career, Professor McEnery has used corpus methods to investigate many different issues, ranging from theoretical linguistics to social and historical issues to applied concerns like health communication and now even Gen AI. Thank you for joining the podcast today, Professor McEnery.
My pleasure.
So I thought we could start with something very basic, but since much of your work uses or focuses on corpus linguistics, could you start off just by telling us what is corpus linguistics?
Very good question. It's a rather obscure title for the field. It'd probably be better called something like looking at language through looking at lots of language data. That's really what it's about. Or as a colleague once put it, you look at a hell of a lot of text on a computer. So that might sound like an unusual thing to do or sort of just a bland thing to do to most people who aren't linguists. But for a long time, linguists thought that you really shouldn't look at language by looking at what is written and spoken. That sounds odd, I know, to many people. But certainly researchers like Noam Chomsky argued for that position very strongly on the basis of a series of arguments which I think are actually easily dismissed, but they were very influential for a long time. So corpus linguistics grew in reaction to that, especially, say, in Northern Europe, the UK, to some extent America, and Hong Kong as well, actually. People thinking, no, a good way to study language is to look at what is said and what is written and use that as the evidence that we use in order to explore language. It has advantages in that you can make observations at scale. Rather than getting distracted by one or two distracting examples, you can say, well, actually putting it back in context, that's infrequent. So you can get a lot of useful frequency data out of there. And that frequency data has a whole range of applications. Of course, the approach really wasn't possible at scale until computers were developed. But it's strange, almost as soon as computers were developed, people got the idea that, hey, at last we can actually look at large volumes of writing. So in the late 1940s and into the 1950s, people started to use data processing machinery in order to look at hundreds of thousands, and by the 1960s, 1 million words and so on. Nowadays, we look at billions of words of data. So it's an approach really which required some intellectual development, the argument that looking at what is written and spoken is helpful, but also some technological development, because without computers on your side, there is no way you're going to look at 1 billion words or even 1 million words of data and do so accurately and swiftly. And that we can do typically with machines.
So it's nice to hear you start off with saying that corpus linguistics comes out of wanting to look at how language is really used. I'm a sociolinguist, so of course there's some similarities, some shared interest there.
There is.
But then you said corpus linguistics is also specifically about looking at just a lot of text. And what are the things that corpus linguists are looking for when they look at a lot of text? You mentioned frequency.
Yeah. Okay, well, frequency is the most obvious thing that we can get out of large-scale collections of data. If you actually ask people for their intuitions about what is frequent, what is infrequent, they're typically quite bad. Even when you ask linguists, they're typically quite bad because we tend to get distracted by what is salient or unusual. And actually, the usual stuff really passes us by. So it's a good corrective to that. I would modify slightly what I've said in that we don't want to fetishize scale. The right size of corpus is the corpus that's big enough to answer the question that you have. So sometimes if we're looking at very frequent features, we actually don't need a lot of data. So we can use a corpus approach, but with small data sets. So really the research question dominates when we ask the question, how large should things be? But nonetheless, even with smaller data sets, it can still be, I'll say backbreaking, it's metaphorical, work to look at 20 or 30,000 words of data. So when I first started teaching this in class in the early 1990s, the software that we had in those days could allow you to look at 40,000 words of data in the classroom. Well, if I'd asked them to do that on pen and paper, we wouldn't have finished any of the tasks within that 1 hour. So even with relatively small data sets like that, we can use the corpus to look at them, the corpus searching software to look at them. And then we can get insights based on frequency. What are those insights, you ask? Well, for example, when it comes to language teaching, one way of approaching teaching vocabulary is to teach the most frequent words first. So, there are figures bandied about. I'm sure they vary slightly, but something like the most 100 frequent words make up something like 80% of speech in English. So in some ways, using frequency as a guide, don't be the slave of it, but using it as a guide can be a very useful way to intervene in language pedagogy and make sure that it's efficient. More interestingly, we can also look at theoretical constructs and start to look at them when they're based on frequency. So there's been something of a revolution in linguistics in the past 20 or so years. Because we can now look at frequency data, we can start to see whether or not words occurring with one another in recurring patterns actually may be the basis of language acquisition in the human infant. And there's a lot of work now on so-called usage-based models of language. And also we can see how those patterns vary through time as a speech community, the people who speak that language, use and develop the language. And it's very hard to do that type of work without the corpus data because our intuitions, as I've said, about frequency are pretty lousy. But nonetheless, those things have proved to be very influential. I'll give you a final example, simply because it's now so accepted, people may find it difficult to believe. But dictionaries never used to be based on this type of data, but now they typically, for the English language, are. It's very hard to find a dictionary now which doesn't boast of the corpus, the body of texts, that it's used in order to generate the entries of that dictionary. Why is that important? Well, again, when you go to the dictionary, you typically want the meanings of a word ordered by frequency. You want to look at the most frequent first. You want to know which is the usual meaning of this word, etc. So that type of frequency information has revolutionized dictionary making. And as we've got data which goes further and further back into the past, it's also revolutionized what's said in the entries about when the earliest use of a word was, for example. So in all sorts of ways, corpus linguistics has crept into the world and influenced it in quite profound ways. And people tend not to notice.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You've already addressed some of this. I mean, you've talked about how corpus linguistics is useful for pedagogical purposes, for language learning, for dictionaries, and also for more kind of questions of scholarship about how language has changed over time, or what language is, how people learn it. You've also, I think, looked at how corpus linguistics can apply to very practical applied linguistics concerns like health communication, and also even some social issues, how we can understand social issues better. So when it comes to health arenas or social issues where, it might not seem as obviously about learning language or language per se, how does corpus linguistics, why does it become useful in all of these different ways?
Well, I'll give you an example. I'm sure it happens here in Hong Kong. It certainly does in the UK where we did the work. People often ask patients for their experience of services. So, they say, rate this on a scale of 1 to 10, rate that on a scale of 1 to 10. But then often they also allow the patients to write in an answer as to why they've given that particular rating. Now, the NHS in the UK is the healthcare provider everybody uses, and typically they would look at the numeric data because they knew how to analyze it. They could count the numbers up, divide them, get an average. But they'd often scratch their head looking at the textual data simply because there was such a large volume of it. Well, large volume is something that we've been dealing with for a long time in corpus linguistics. So we were able to look at that data for them and tell them what the patients were saying, what the main themes were, etc. So we were able to actually help them to access some of the messages that the patients were putting into the data and allow them to pull out the main themes that help them understand the numeric scores that they were looking at, for example. Also with social issues, I'll give an example again from the UK. A lot of people in the Muslim community in the UK complained about press bias, and they've been able to show 1 or 2 press articles, which they said demonstrated the bias. And the pushback was always, well, that's just 1 or 2 articles. So what we were able to do was collect every single article that mentioned Muslims and Islam over a 20-year period. There was also a longer study, but I'll say a 20-year period. And again, that's a lot of text. We have the techniques to look at it. We were able to analyze that data. Now, I'm not saying that we were looking for evidence for bias. That wasn't our goal. Our goal was simply to talk about how Muslims and Islam were talked about in the UK press. We made that very clear from the start, that we wouldn't simply say that bias was there. We would say what was there. And because we took that approach, and because we looked at the totality of the data, and because we used a reliable method to do so, when we did find bias, it was much more empowering for those people who wanted to make the argument that the press had bias within it, because they could point at that research, which didn't seek to discover that in the first instance, accounted for all of the data, and demonstrated where things were and were not biased using a reliable method. And that had very positive effects, with some newspapers changing their stance and the way that they wrote about that community. So that's a good example, I think, of how sometimes we can intervene on social issues in an objective fashion and actually empower or perhaps even refute what some people are saying about the data itself.
Mm. Yeah, thanks for all these different examples. It comes all the way, I guess corpus linguistics really touches on, or can be used to touch on, almost every aspect of social and communicative life. And recently you wrote about the relationship between corpus linguistics and GenAI. And you said that, many people don't really notice or don't think about the fact that corpus linguistics was an early pioneer in GenAI. And you talk a little bit about the significant similarities between corpus linguistics and GenAI, but this also leads you to some critical perspectives. So, in this current moment where many people in our field and in the world have concerns about GenAI, are excited to use it, can you share with us a little bit about your perspectives on GenAI?
The difficult part there is going to be a little bit, because there's a lot to say. But let me start off with one of the observations that you made, that there are points of similarity between GenAI and corpus linguistics. There is a very important one. If we go back to the conversation at the start here, where I was talking about how we want to study linguistics by what is said and what is written, and the arguments from the past to say that that wasn't useful data for studying language, the arguments really rested on the claim that you couldn't acquire language that way. Human infants weren't really attending to what was said and copying what was said. That wasn't the way it worked. Well, that usage-based approach that I was talking to you about has started to show that it is. And GenAI, in a way, is a very powerful demonstration that you can learn human language by observing it at scale. Now, there are differences, I would immediately point out, between what the machine is doing in looking at millions and billions of words to acquire human language or human-like performance, and what a human infant does. The machines require billions of words. They've looted all of the libraries in the world to get the performance that they've got. The human infant probably is exposed to something like 10 million words and actually ends up with a better understanding of language than the machine does. So they're not quite the same thing, but they are based on the same input, in my opinion, which is language as it is spoken and ultimately written. So that's a very important way in which corpus linguistics and GenAI are similar. We believe that the data itself is a fit object for modeling human language, and GenAI is a really very interesting demonstration that that observation is sufficient for us to say that language could be acquired in this way. So that's one important observation. But also, a lot of that early work in corpus linguistics was picked up by people who took that approach to getting the machines to understand language. We never used to do it that way. People used to think of very abstract rules. They try and write out the rules of language, very much following the inspiration of people like Chomsky, who thought that language was produced by an underlying set of rules that produced all the language we speak or write. Computer scientists also worked for a long time trying to craft those rules in order to get the machines to do it. They failed miserably. And then late in the 1970s, an engineer at IBM called Fred Jelinek actually said, well, I'm not going to do it that way. I'm going to do it on the basis of lots of data and using that to model human language in the ways in which I've been talking about. And he produced the first really viable speech recognition systems like that. At university I used to work at, Lancaster University, they took that observation and produced the first system that could actually do grammatical analyses using that type of observation. People like Geoffrey Leach, Jeffrey Sampson, Roger Garside did that work. So that work in the late 70s, early 80s is in some ways an interesting precursor to how AI works now. It's not typically working on the basis of find the rules and use those rules in order to process and produce language. It's working on the basis of observed data, model from data, produce on the basis of what you've observed. So that's a really powerful way in which the two are linked. But for me, in terms of how I work now, they're also linked in that the AI can allow me to do some of the things that we were talking about before in new ways. So I can use some of the AI tools now in order to begin to approach texts rather than using some of the tools I would have used in the past. In doing that, we have to be cautious. Why do we have to be cautious? Well, I'm sure that people listening to this will have used AI and got so-called hallucinated answers from it, for example. Also, we need to remember that we have the expertise. If we're linguists and we've spent most of our life studying language and the machine's doing something with language, the likelihood is that we are the experts and we will spot the errors in what it's doing. So we need to be careful not to inherit the errors from AI analyses. We need not to lose our expertise. We need to use it to improve the outputs and retrain the machines if needs be to get the outputs we want, or set those outputs aside because they can't produce analyses that we think are of sufficient quality that we could produce ourselves. So I'd say caution. Every time you use AI for a new task, test that it's doing things as well as you could do. Test the validity of the answers. Don't fall down the rabbit hole of spending a lot of time trying to get the AI to do something when in fact you could do it more efficiently yourself. You have the expertise. Remember that. You've spent a long time acquiring that expertise. So there are ways in which AI has a similar birth, if you like, or modern AI has a similar birth to corpus linguistics. There are ways in which it's now interacting with corpus linguistics to allow us to do things sometimes more swiftly and efficiently, but we need to retain a degree of caution throughout in using it.
I think that's it's really interesting going back to what you first said, that the way that a child learns language, the way that these computers are learning language are in some ways, similar, but interestingly that the human actually needs less data and comes out with more reliable or...
Yes, it needs less energy too.
And less energy, yeah.
A human child will burn something like the energy equivalent of a 100-watt light bulb in a day. That's all the energy it takes. As we know, AI is famously greedy for energy. So although we can draw equivalences between some of the ways in which language are learned by the machine and ways in which it's learned by human infants, there are very profound differences which point that they're not doing quite the same thing.
Yeah. Does that also influence your perspectives on, or your advice that you might give to students thinking about, using AI, not using AI, when to use AI, how to use it, how to rely on it as you would rely on an interlocutor Yeah,
I think it would in two ways. Firstly, people, and I think it's healthy that they're doing this, but people are now theorizing that they could use AI models in order to look at the human mind or the human brain. In other words, they use it as a sort of in silico version of the human brain, and they can look at its interior states and try to work out what humans must be doing. They should remember that this isn't quite the same. It's a model, and models are not reality. They're a useful simplification of reality for the purpose of study at best, but they're not reality. So I'd be very cautious about making grand claims about the workings of the human mind based on exploring AI models for those reasons. So that's the first observation that I'd make in terms of things that people should be cautious about. The second thing I think people should be cautious about, linguists approaching the AI and the technology and wanting to use it in their own research, is we also know that we can do some things better. So I'm sure that many people will have interacted with GenAI systems and discovered that they have relatively short memories. You have to go back and keep on reminding it of things that you wanted it to do. They're not in the social world. They may be able to reflect it from the data that they've ingested, but they're not part of the social world. They don't really have feelings, for example. So they're not really the same type of analyst as you. Of course, all of these things might be dealt with in the future, but another point I'd look at would be to say that they have a positivity bias. They're incredibly enthusiastic and positive. So, I can do that for you, even when they can't. So don't over-rely on them, and don't, if you like, denigrate your own expertise. You're still the expert. Don't forget that. Because if you do, the other danger is a sort of epistemic narrowing. What do I mean by that? Well, you end up doing the things that can be done automatically, and you forget the things that are worth doing that you can't do automatically, but that you could do once upon a time as a linguist, and they were very helpful in your studies. That would be a disastrous outcome, that we actually say AI can do everything because we've limited the range of things that we do. That mustn't be the answer to how AI gets adopted in our research. We should use it where we can use it, and we should carry on using other methods, approach, techniques based upon our expertise where we can't use it.
That's great. Thank you. You have recently moved to Hong Kong to join our department, which we're all very happy about. And now that you're here, I'm sure you'll be continuing with Corpus Linguistics work, but are there any things that you're looking forward to working on, being in the context of Hong Kong in particular, and how that might shape your research as you move forward?
Yes, well, there's a strong strand of research which I've pursued for many years focused on the Chinese language. So it's the most obvious benefit for me being in Hong Kong. It was always quite easy for me to work with scholars in China or people who visited Lancaster who also had that interest. But being here in Hong Kong, of course, just makes things so much easier in that respect. So I have research partnerships with people in Shanghai at Shanghai International Studies University and Xi'an in Xi'an Jiaotong University. I also know people here in PolyU itself, and also City University or Hong Kong University, for example. So it's a very nice context for me to slip into. One of the things I'm really interested in doing in the short term, which would use that context very well, is look at differences in paralinguistic features between Chinese and English, and then how that's realized in L2 English, somebody speaking English as their second language with Chinese as an L1, their first language. Because some research I've been doing recently looking at laughter and how laughter is used as a communicative device in face-to-face interactions suggests that, in fact, laughter is a learned behavior in a second language. There are different norms across L1s for how laughter is deployed in conversation, what purposes it's deployed for, and that can get transferred into an L2, and that then may change perceptions of the speaker. So, for example, sometimes people can use laughter to indicate humility, if you like. And there certainly seems to be some evidence from the data that Chinese speakers are more inclined to use laughter for that purpose and will transfer that into their L2 English. Whereas, say, for example, Italian speakers don't. They tend to transfer across laughter for affinity, building social relationships, which they produce more frequently. So part of the work I want to look at here is what happens when people use a resource like laughter in their face-to-face communication in a second language, and how we can see whether or not carrying over habits, if you like, from one language to another may have a negative effect on them. I've been looking at high-stakes language examinations. So there could be very real outcomes if there are some differences which negatively impact on performance or perceptions of the learner. And then that in turn can be useful for AI systems in the future. If people have interacted with these chatbots, I'm sure they'll realize that they don't do much in the way of laughter. It's not something that's really modeled for them. They've never been given the data to do it. So I'm very interested in looking at it, in part to try and improve language examinations, our understanding of what happens when we speak in a second language, but also ultimately to try to improve human-computer interactions by giving the computers a better sense of what language is used for, what laughter is used for, and how the two interact in spoken conversation. So there's an example of what I'll be doing here.
Yeah, sounds very interesting. We'll look forward to hearing more about the outcomes of this research. Yeah, I think these are the things that I was hoping we could discuss today. And maybe to just finish off, for any students who might be listening and maybe have some interest in language but aren't quite sure how they want to approach it. I'm thinking of myself when I started studying linguistics and how I was also interested in what is corpus linguistics and what can you do with it?
Yes.
What would you say to students about, the kinds of things that you might consider if you wanted to study language more, and more specifically study language through something like corpus linguistics?
Yeah. Okay. On the general question, first of all, I'll give an answer that might be unsatisfactory, but it's an honest one. Follow your passions. Doing academic research is very taxing, very time consuming. And unless you're really interested in what you're doing, you'll find it very difficult. You won't be very well motivated. You'll find it perhaps even a miserable experience. So I'd say follow your passions. Think about why you're studying this subject, what you want to achieve through it, from the range of things that you can achieve from it. and pursue your interests and passions, because it will make you a better researcher ultimately. You'll be more motivated and you'll be prepared to give more time to the study that you're interested in than the study you're not interested in. So follow your passions. It's what life is about. We're here once, use the time well. In the more narrow question of how would you use it in studying corpus linguistics, well, again, I point out from my own experience and my own career that with imagination, you can see that language is pretty much everywhere. It's one of the challenges, I think, for linguists, that when they approach other disciplines, they often find language being studied. So if you go and talk to sociologists, they're often studying language. You talk to psychologists, they're often studying language. Historians, they're looking at texts all of the time. So linguistics is odd in the sense that it feels it possesses language as an area of study, but as soon as it looks outside the field, it finds other people who think they possess language. So I'd say think about the breadth of studies that you can engage in, where you're interested in working with others, but also if you're interested in working with others beyond linguistics, how you're going to convince them that they should work with a linguist. What do we bring to the party, so to speak? What does our principal focus on the study of language give us in terms of skills and expertise that we can offer to these other people? Often we can offer real insights because, of course, it really is what we're interested in. But we also need to understand what they want to achieve through the study of language so that we can better match what we're doing with what they need. And of course, sometimes the most difficult conversation to have of all is to tell somebody that they're looking at something in the wrong way. So try and focus on the positive. Tell them what they can achieve with your work, not how wrong they've been to study things the way that they're studying them. So think broadly. Again, follow your passions. Approach other subjects with humility and positivity, because they'll feel that they know how to talk about language too. And think very carefully about what your contribution can be and how you can push things forward, whether you're interested in something which is solely in linguistics or across those disciplinary boundaries.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor McHenry.
My great pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on Exploring the Humanities from the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. For more episodes or information, visit our website or follow us on Spotify. Stay tuned for discussions with leading voices from the Faculty of Humanities and beyond.